about this today. So let me see whether my slides are able to move. Yeah, they are moving. So concentration mechanisms, I think we must move very fast. This slide is, everything in this slide is known to you. It's nothing new. The only thing we have been talking about since we started was that the kidney adjusts volume and composition of both intracellular and extracellular compartments of the body. And we had said that those compartments must be kept hemostatically stable so that the cell can provide, can get an ideal environment within which to operate, whether it's in terms of pH, or it's in terms of individual ions, or in terms of osmolarity. So all these are important. And of course, the aim is always to keep the osmolarity at roughly 300 milliosmoles. No, it's not exact. The exact figure is just about 290. 300 we use for the purpose of making it a bit easier for everybody to understand. And therefore, to be able to maintain an osmolarity that is constant in the extracellular fluid, and if the kidney is that organ that does that through either passing out a lot of urine or conserving urine. So if the osmolarity is high, water will be conserved so that the osmolarity is brought back down. If the osmolarity is low, it's dilute, the plasma osmolarity is low, it's maybe 250. It means you have to give out into the environment the excess pure water so that you raise the osmolarity back to 290 milliosmoles per liter. And therefore, from the outset, you can see that if you want to control body osmolarity, you must either pass a lot of urine or conserve urine. And if you pass in a lot of urine, the urine is going to be very dilute in terms of osmolarity. If you're going to conserve water, then the amount of the concentration of urine is going to be too much. The osmolarity is going to be high. So the urine can either be therefore concentrated or dilute, depending on what it wants to correct within the extracellular. That is self-explanatory. So you can either pass dilute urine or concentrated urine, depending on what you want to correct the body. The mechanisms for concentrating or diluting urine are also there. You know, the countercurrent mechanisms of the body, and then of course there are endocrine functions or endocrine aspects that also contribute to the concentration of urine. And sometimes it's not just also concentration of urine, even as we said earlier, the medulla of the kidneys. The kidney has a cortex and a medulla. The nephron has a cortex and a medulla. And therefore, the medulla is always concentrated, as we talked about earlier. If for whatever reason it is not concentrated, you will end up losing water in urine. And that water can be so excess that you can get very dehydrated within a very short while. So which are these mechanisms that we talk about? The countercurrent mechanisms. The countercurrent systems are just flows, and they are subserved by the two systems, either the loop of Henle, which has a descending and ascending portion, and we also have the vasa recti, which are also groups of vessels that descend along the descending loop of Henle, and then ascend along the ascending loop of Henle. So these are two parallel systems that are present. And in order to perform the counter current mechanism, it is assumed that the system must have a certain anatomical arrangement. And the anatomical arrangement is that you must have two limbs that are parallel to each other, like the descending and ascending loop of Henle. They are parallel to each other. Their flow is counter to each other. So the descending loop, the flow of urine is going down, or filtrate is going down. The ascending loop of Henle, the flow of fluid is going up. So they are parallel, and they have a flow of whatever it is in them that is opposite each other. In terms of the vasa recta, it is blood that will be moving down, and then in the ascending loop, it is moving up in the vasa recta. Now, to ensure that this system works efficiently, these two limbs must be very close together. You can't have one here and one those sides and expect that that counter current system is going to work well to concentrate the medulla and then ensure that urine is dealt with appropriately. So they must be close to each other. So any nephron with ascending descending loop of Henle, the descending and ascending loop of Henle are always parallel, their flow is counter, and they are close or in proximity to each other. And the last thing is that they must learn for a certain distance. So distance in terms of concentration becomes important. So in other words, we knock off completely the cortical nephrons. So the nephrons that are going to participate in concentration mechanisms of the kidney, by definition, are going to be those ones that are juxtamedullary. So remember we said earlier they are cortical nephrons and they are juxtamedullary nephrons that dig deep into the medulla. And this one's constitutes in human beings between 10 and 15% only of the nephrons that we talked about in terms of 1 million in each kidney. 10 to 15% is the juxtamedullary. And therefore, it is only in those juxtamedullary nephrons that countercurrent mechanisms can function efficiently because it satisfies these 4 anatomical criteria that we have talked about. So let's look at what happens. Say, for instance, in the loop of Henle, we already said the juxtamedullary and through the limbs. So the fluid in. So if you look at the countercurrent multiplier, there's something we call the countercurrent multiplier. The countercurrent multiplier utilizes the anatomical structures we refer to as the loop of Henle, the descending and ascending loop of Henle, to ensure that the kidneys are concentrated down there so that they can perform the function of concentrating and diluting urine. So the fluid in the descending loop of Henle creates a current that is counter to that of the ascending loop, as we have said. The ascending loop of Henle is impermeable to water. So we start by how does this concentration takes place? So if you look at the ascending loop of Henle, it is impermeable to water. So water is retained within it. However, it is permeable to sodium chloride. So sodium chloride is given out. It's given out through the ascending loop of Henle into the medulla or into the interstitium of the medulla. This accumulates in the peritubular fluid in the medulla, making it hypertonic. So within the tubular lumen, within, for instance, the lumen where the filtrate is, the fluid is going to be hypotonic. But on the outside in the medulla, you'll end up with hypertonicity created by absorption of sodium chloride along the ascending loop of Henle. So that sodium concentrates the medulla. Now, when you look at the descending loop of Henle, we already talked about the descending loop of Henle earlier. We said the descending loop, if you start at the proximal convoluted tubule, the milliosmoles of the urine, is just the same as that of plasma, 300 milliosmoles. But as the fluid descends down within the lumen, the sodium is retained within the lumen. There is no reabsorption of sodium. However, water is removed from the lumen of the descending loop of Henle as sodium chloride is retained. What is the net effect of these two procedures is that the urine, the filtrate within the lumen becomes concentrated as you descend to the depth of the descending loop of Henle. And we said last time that that descent actually causes a concentration gradient that is 4 times. So at the beginning of the loop of Henle, we have 300 milliosmoles. At the tip, at the end, at the depth of the loop of Henle, where the loop of Henle turns to the ascending loop of Henle, the milliosmoles concentration of urine of that filtrate within the lumen is 1,200. Very concentrated. So the descending loop, therefore, is a concentrating loop, part of the loop. And if you look at, for instance, that there are 1 million or so nephrons, 10 to 15% of which are actually the ones participating in this concentration, you'll find it's quite a sizable number of nephrons which have concentrations of 1,200 at the depth of the medulla, which helps also to concentrate the medulla. And once the sodium has been concentrated within the lumen, it ascends. When it ascends, that sodium is not allowed to go into the discoconvoluted tubule and the collecting ducts. That sodium is reabsorbed into the medulla. So you concentrate the sodium, then you allow it to go into the medulla, and you are concentrating the medulla. And that concentration of the medulla, we have seen why it is important. So each cycle increases and multiplies sodium chloride concentration. And therefore, the concentration of sodium chloride is greatest at the depth of the medulla as you go down, for the reasons that we have talked about. Water has been removed in the descending loop of Henle. Sodium chloride is retained. Therefore, the concentration is maximum at 1,200 milliosmoles at the depth of the medulla, where the loop of Henle turns to go upwards. So that gradient is huge, it's big. And therefore, it is the one that participates in the reabsorption of sodium or the reabsorption of water. Finally, when the aquaporin channels are open in what we referred yesterday as the as the mechanisms of reabsorption of water in the collecting ducts through aldosterone or vasopressin. So, having said that, remember we're talking about the two systems, the counter-current multiplier. The counter-current multiplier uses the loop of Henle as their anatomical structures for its functionality. Basically, what we have seen is it concentrates the medulla. So if you're asked, what is the function of the counter-current mechanism? What is the main function, the main goal of the counter-current system? Or not of the counter-current, of the they multiply, the countercurrent multiply, because there are two systems. This we're going to talk about the exchanger, but this is the multiplier. So what is the function of the countercurrent multiplier? Is to concentrate the medulla. That is the function of the countercurrent mechanism, and it is important you go and look at it and see this multiplier, what it does and how it multiplies and concentrates the medulla. Now, the second system is the countercurrent exchanger. The countercurrent exchanger has also anatomical structures that it uses. The countercurrent exchanger uses the vasa recti. The vasa recti are the series of efferent, the second row of efferent arterioles that are actually produced after you have come from the Bowman's capsule, the tuft of capillaries. You have arterioles, efferent arterioles. Then a tuft of capillaries, you end up with efferent arterioles. These efferent arterioles will break into vasa recti in terms of when it comes to the long nephron, the juxtamedullary nephrons. So these vasa recti also descend and ascend along the ascending loop of Henle. So let's look at the descending portion of the vasa recti. The flow is slow. Sodium diffuses into the capillaries. Remember that for capillaries, these are vessels, really. It is both permeable to water and sodium chloride. The countercurrent system, in terms of multiply, in terms of descending and ascending loop of Henle, we saw that the descending loop of Henle is permeable only to water and not to sodium. So the descending loop of Henle is permeable to both sodium chloride and water. So we find that sodium chloride then diffuses into the capillaries. When it is descending, sodium chloride is reabsorbed. It's absorbed within the vessel. The vessel picks up sodium chloride because in the surrounding, sodium chloride is concentrated, is quite high. Goes into the vessel. But as it ascends, the ascending portion of the vasa recti, most of the sodium chloride moves back into the peritubular capillary and moves back into the medullary interstitial space. So most sodium chloride that was absorbed in the descending loop of Henle, when it's ascending, it is still given back into the peritubular capillaries or the medullary interstitium. So very little sodium chloride, therefore, is carried away from the medulla through both systems, whether it is the descending loop of Henle, countercurrent mechanisms, countercurrent multiplier, or it is the vasa recti, as we are talking about now. Very little sodium chloride is carried away from the depth of the medulla. And therefore, both systems are geared towards concentration of the medulla. Both systems are geared towards concentration of the medulla. So if you're asked again, as I'm going to ask at the end of this year, if you're asked again, so we have seen two systems, countercurrent multiplier, countercurrent exchanger. Countercurrent exchanger uses the vasa recti, absorbing sodium into the vessel in the descending loop, and that sodium chloride is released back into the interstitium when the vessel is ascending. So it leaves, it concentrates the sodium in the medulla. So if you are asked, what is the goal of the countercurrent exchanger? The countercurrent exchanger is to maintain a concentrated medulla. That is the function of the countercurrent exchanger. So, however, or whichever book you're going to read, however you're going to look at it, you must look at the two systems, the counter current multiplier, and agree and understand the mechanisms by which the function of the counter current multiplier is to create a concentrated medulla. Second, the counter current exchanger, you must agree, in however how you're going to read it, that it maintains a concentrated medulla. So one system creates it, the other system maintains it, and therefore it would not bother us so much. We don't even have to worry all the time, every day, whether once the aquaporin 2 channels are open through the vasopressin, once the aquaporin 2 channels are open, it doesn't worry us which side it's going to be concentrated. We don't worry that urine is going to flow the opposite direction. What is going to flow the opposite direction? Water must flow from the lumen to the medulla, because the medulla will always be concentrated by these mechanisms. And therefore, when that happens, then you are going to have a concentrated urine. You'll produce little concentrated urine because most of the fluid has been reabsorbed back into a concentrated medulla. Now, of course, there are other systems that help this concentration. And by now, of course, we should know that there's an endocrine contribution to this system. And some of them we have seen. For instance, when we talk about the discontinued tubule, earlier we had said that aldosterone is produced from the suprarenal gland and facilitates reabsorption of sodium, and therefore water follows. So that water that is reabsorbed at the discontinued tubule back into the interstitium, whether it's a cortical or part of it is in the medulla, it helps to concentrate the medulla. So aldosterone in its own way assists this concentration of the medulla. We must not forget urea, as we had said earlier. We must not forget urea, as we had talked about earlier. We said that urea is reabsorbed both in the proximal and the collecting ducts, and once it is reabsorbed, it also goes into the medulla to participate in the concentration of. In fact, urea contributes 50% of the concentration mechanisms of the medulla. Urea contributes 50%. So at the end of the day, this is a whole area. I have tried to summarize it as hard as I can, that the concentration mechanisms of the medulla are there. They are important. They sit at the core of ensuring that at one point you produce dilute urine, at one point you produce concentrated urine, with the aim of maintaining or ensuring that the status of the extracellular fluid is maintained constantly at a given osmolarity. Now I will share we will discuss something. Let me just share this first. Where is that? Let me share this first. We will look at the endocrine functions of the kidney. The kidney, the main aim of the kidney we now know. If you start from the Bowman's capsule all the way to the collecting ducts, we have seen what it does. We have seen the main reason why the kidney does exist. And we are now talking about extra functions of the kidney, which is in terms of endocrine. And this endocrine function you have covered also in other areas, you have covered in other fields. So I will be as fast as I can. So the kidney produces therefore certain hormones. Some people will call them enzymes to perform certain critical functions within the body, not necessarily within the kidney, but in other organs around the body. And therefore, at any one time, if you have kidney failure or the kidney is not working well, it will not just be the toxins that will not be removed. It's not just the potassium that's not going to be controlled. It's not just that, you're going to end up with, waterlogging. Those ones will occur, as we have talked about. However, you will also end up with problems relating to the hormones that it does produce, which will not be getting produced. So which are these hormones? The juncture glomerular apparatus, secretes three main hormones. And if you go to the juncture, we talked earlier about the juncture glomerular apparatus, which is a region within the kidney, proximal convoluted tubule, distal convoluted tubule. Some cells come in together to create a certain zone there that has granular cells that produce certain hormones. Three hormones are produced: erythropoietin, renin, and 1,25-dihydrocholecalciferol. So if we start with the erythropoietin is produced by the kidney. I don't know whether you can see my slide. Let me see whether I can. Yeah. Erythropoietin is produced by the kidney, juncture glomerular apparatus. What is the trigger for production of erythropoietin is hypoxia. So if you have hypoxia from whatever cause, from whatever reason, you're climbing Mount Kenya and you are climbing height. As you go higher and higher, the oxygen is thinning out, and therefore the oxygen available to you in your system is going to be smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. So if you want to compensate, you're going to have to produce excess red blood cells. So that although the oxygen is small and thin within the environment, if you have a lot more RBCs, then all those RBCs now will pick the oxygen and transport it, and you'll still have enough oxygen in your system. So what we are saying is that hypoxia of any cause, and as a second-year medical student now, you can sit yourself down and look at what are the causes of hypoxia. What region? I've just told you one may be climbing height. If you go to top of Mount Kenya, you will start hammering if you are not acclimatized, because the amount of air is thin, oxygen there is thin. But one of the adaptations that the body will make automatically is to produce excess RBCs. So the action of this particular hormone is to stimulate the bone marrow to produce red blood cells. Within the red blood cells, we know are hemoglobin, which carry 99% of the oxygen around the body. So if the oxygen is little, you have excess RBCs, you will still carry enough oxygen to your system. So it's one of the adaptations as well. For instance, if you bleed 4 of your 6 liters on the road and you come to the hospital, any casualty, with only 2 liters of your blood running in your veins, what is going to happen is that this hormone is also produced, so that the body recognizes that there will be little oxygen in your system. But the more RBCs you have, the more chances are, although you have very little blood, if you have a lot of RBCs within that little blood that you have, you can still carry oxygen to your tissues. So this happens all the time when you have acute lack of oxygen around the environment, or you have bled acutely. If you measure erythropoietin, the body will find it is high. And if you go to the bone marrow or you look at peripheral blood film, you'll find there are very many immature and mature red blood cells that are being produced at a very fast rate to deal with the situation. So the kidney does this. So you can imagine, for instance, if you have kidney failure, acute or chronic, it is very possible that production of RBCs is going to be compromised. And there is no wonder that all patients, most patients with chronic renal failure will also end up with anemia. They will end up with low levels of blood because RBCs are not being produced as much. The second hormone that is produced is renin. Renin is produced from granular cells. Renin is always produced from the granular cells of the juxtagonal apparatus. And renin is not a new hormone to any second-year medical student. In fact, I have a feeling talking about renin is extremely boring because you know it like any other thing that you know very well. So renin will go to the liver, will convert angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 will leave the liver and go to the lungs. And using angiotensin converting enzyme, angiotensin 1 will be converted to angiotensin 2. And angiotensin 2, we know the functions. It has many, many functions. You can write an essay. If you are in an oral exam, you can talk for 5 hours without ceasing about angiotensin 2. I'll just try to see which let me try and see which. Yes, so some of the functions of angiotensin 2 I've just mentioned here. This is just some. It's not exhaustive, it's some. So angiotensin 2 is a powerful vasoconstrictor. And vasoconstriction is a defensive mechanism against low blood pressure, against hypotension, against bleeding. It ensures that the blood pressure is maintained irrespective of what the volume of blood that you have. So if you have vasoconstriction, it's a very important adaptive mechanisms. So angiotensin 2 is one of those that causes that. It also causes production of aldosterone secretion. And we know what aldosterone does in the distal tubule. It aids in the reabsorption of sodium and ultimately the reabsorption of water. So if you have shock, you have hypovolemia, you have all those things that we talk about, low blood pressure, all those, then aldosterone 2 is important because it will make sure that the amount of water and sodium that is being absorbed is high enough to keep the blood pressure high. ADH or vasopressin is also stimulated. The production of vasopressin or ADH is stimulated by angiotensin 2. We know now that if you go to the kidney, they're collecting that vasopressin through the mechanisms that we talked about the other day, combines to V2 receptors, creates aquaporin 2 channels. Those aquaporin 2 channels, once they are created, water will move from a region of high concentration to a region of low concentration, and always because the medulla is concentrated, water will move from the lumen of the collecting duct into the interstitium of the medulla, and that is reabsorption, so that you end up with concentrated urine, and most of the water is reabsorbed to go back and shore or support the blood pressure that is low. It also stimulates thirst, and we know, of course, most people, when you bled 6 of your 5 of your 6 liters on the road and you come, you'll be thirsty. Most people in accident emergency departments after losing blood, children who come with dehydration from diarrhea and vomiting, high fever, anything that will cause you to have low blood pressure, low blood volume, hypovolemia of any kind. Thirst is always stimulated so that you drink. If you are conscious, you're drinking to ensure that you sustain your blood pressure. And all these angiotensin 2 is one of those ones that does that very comfortably. It also ensures that sodium is reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule, and so on and so on. So I've only talked about 1 or 2 or 3 functions of angiotensin 2. If you pick any textbook of physiology and anatomy, you can find maybe 22 others. And once you have corrected the blood pressure, once you have corrected the hypovolemia, once shock has been overcome, then there's a negative feedback on renin, so that renin production is reduced, and therefore you go back to normal. Now, the last hormone, of course, not the last, but the last major hormone is referred to as the 125 dihydrocholecalciferol. You will find this also in any textbooks out of Sahara. These are the so-called vitamin D group of issues. So 125 dihydrocholecalciferol is considered the most active form of vitamin D, a cascade that starts from the skin with pre-vitamin D, cholecalciferol. So cholecalciferol, for instance, is converted to 25-hydroxy cholecalciferol in the liver. So calciferol is found on the skin. It's pre-vitamin D, so to speak. Through ultraviolet light, it's converted to 25-hydroxy cholecalciferol in the liver. That 25-hydroxy cholecalciferol is transported to the kidneys, and then it is converted to the most active form of vitamin D, which is 125-dihydrocholecalciferol. I've used abbreviations here. I don't expect any student to use abbreviations. I think this is a time when I will say that don't do what I do. And I think you must take me serious here. If you write 25OHD3, I will not understand what it is. I will give you a 0. Therefore, you must go and look at it. All these things have full names. 25-hydroxy cholecalciferol to 125-dihydrocholecalciferol. That conversion is done in the kidneys. So conversion of 25-hydroxy to 125-dihydrocholecalciferol is done within the kidney. And that action requires certain cofactors. What are the cofactors needed for the conversion of 25-hydroxy to 125-dihydrocholecalciferol? We have PTH, which is parathyroid hormone, and estrogen. What is the function of 125-dihydrocholecalciferol, which is the most powerful vitamin D that you're going to come across in the body? It maintains calcium levels. How does it do this? Where does it work to do this? That hormone travels to the small intestines and increases reabsorption of calcium. So that is what it does. Increases reabsorption of calcium, maintains calcium in the body. There's a lot of what we refer to as the homeostasis of vitamin D and calcium, and that is going to be covered quite well in the clinical areas. So those three hormones are key to the kidney. So what would happen, for instance, if you have kidney failure? You can see clearly you're going to end up with problems of anemia because of erythropoietin. You'll end up with problems with the bones because calcium may be deficient, and that's why you end up with osteoporosis of renal failure. It is referred to by many names. If you go now and look, you'll find there's something we call osteodystrophies of renal failure. So when you have renal failure, you will have orthopedic surgeons will always have problems with their bones. And then the last thing that we talk about is renin. So if you have problems with maintenance of renin and renin issues, you will find that you have problems with maintaining blood pressure, maintaining good circulation. You'll have all those problems that we talked about, because you might be so dehydrated, but you're not thirsty. You might be so dehydrated, but the ADH is not produced to go and collect water from the collecting ducts. So if you have renal failure, all these aspects, any one of these aspects that now you can tweak will come in. So if you're asked anywhere, why does a patient with chronic renal failure have anemia? The answer should be very obvious. Why does a patient with renal failure have problems with their bones? And those names are big, renal osteodystrophies, and there are specific names that are given to it. So you can end up with osteoporosis. You can end up with fractures of bone, fractures easily of bones. Now, I must mention one other thing. You see, to be able to produce 125 dihydrocholecalciferol, one of the factors that are needed here is estrogen. So postmenopausally, you'll find women don't have estrogen, and therefore they will have a problem with manufacturing 125 dihydrocholecalciferol. And if you dig deeper, you will be told in third year and fourth year and fifth year, as you study, that these patients who are postmenopausal are prone to develop fractures. They fracture very easily. If you have a 60-year-old mother and they just walk a bit, they might just fall a bit and they'll fracture their bone, because they don't have estrogen, and estrogen is needed in their kidneys to manufacture 125 dihydrocholecalciferol and maintain their calcium levels high, and therefore they end up with osteoporosis of old age easily and fractures. So the physiology here explains many things that you're going to come across in the clinical areas. It explains quite a lot of the things that you come across in the clinical areas. Now, of course, there are others. These are small print. Prostaglandins, these are now small prints. You'll also look at them. Some people don't even consider they are hormones, but PGA2, prostaglandin A2, and prostaglandin E2 are very important. They are secreted by the kidneys also. They cause systemic dilatation and hence maintain blood pressure flow. So if you have kidney failure, you'll find that these two are not produced, and therefore maintaining blood pressure may be a problem. But those are small. There are many other things that are good. Yes. There are many other things that are good. Yes. So I will not go. Let me see whether we need anything further than that. I do not need anything further than this. There are some things that we'll need here, but I think we will talk about them later. Renal failure and hypertension, these ones will be covered much later. Kidney failure, I think we're going to deal with later when we have dealt with other things. So I will exit from this, and then we look at something else before I will stop sharing it, and I will go back. So let me see what else we can talk about here today. Concentration dystrophy table, then I will talk about this one, renal assessment, not it. I will talk about micturition. Press rep, can you see the new slide?
Yeah, I can see that.
Oh, it's come. Okay, fine. So I think let's talk about micturition. Now, micturition, we have been talking about the kidneys. And as a second year medical student, you're picking certain aspects of the kidney. You're picked anatomy, you've picked a bit of physiology, you're moving with it. Finally, you will end up in the medicine. And in medicine now, we look at details of what happens to some of the things that we're talking about from a physiological point of view. And for now, then we have manufactured urine. We have filtered 180 liters. We have reabsorbed 178. We have now at the collecting ducts, end of the collecting ducts, and we only have 2 liters of the 178, of the 180 that was filtered. These 2 liters is a product of filtration and selective reabsorption and modification within the tubular system that finally produces 2 liters. And these 2 liters must be given out in urine and voided. It has to pass through the renal pelvis, structures, anatomical structures that we know, because from the collecting ducts, you end up with the renal pelvis. Then from the renal pelvis, you end up with the ureters. From the ureters, there are 2 ureters on both sides. You end up with a urinary bladder that is only 1. So 2 ureters from the left and right joined in the bladder. And from the bladder, then you end up with 1 urethra in both sexes. And finally, you void the urine to the external environment. What are you voiding? Basically, it is water plus a few undesirable components that were filtered, that are considered toxic or are considered byproducts that don't need to be reabsorbed, or byproducts that were some were reabsorbed and was presented in excess, and therefore is given out in urine. So that's what urine is basically made up of: water, urea, creatinine, other small little electrolytes here and there that are not necessary for the body at the time. So how do you get rid of this to the external environment? And this is what we are going to talk about now. And there's a lot of physiology about micturition. Micturition must be looked at, must be studied, must be known, because a lot of the pathologies that you're going to deal with people, a lot of the problems you're going to encounter, patients lying in hospital, will be because of this process has gone wrong. They have manufactured their urine, but they cannot throw it out of the body. So what is micturition and how does it happen? So micturition is defined as a process of voiding urine from the bladder. And I want to note that it's a reflex. You know, in first year, you covered reflexes. And you covered, if I am not wrong, you covered monosynotic reflexes, which was basically a stretch reflex mediated by the muscle spindle. So that if you stretch something, it sets up a reflex that then causes whatever you have stretched to contract. This is how we talked about a stretch reflex, even when it came to the end organs like muscle. So if you stretch a muscle, you have stretched, you have elongated it, the muscle will create a reflex to ensure that it contracts, it goes back to its original size. So even the urinary bladder here, within its wall, it has stretch receptors. So once it is filled to a certain level, the stretch reflector will send impulses, afferent impulses to the spinal cord, which will finally come back and contract the detrosal muscle or the muscles of the bladder so that you can void urine. So stretch always ends up with a reflex that causes contraction or shortening of muscle. These are first year activities you know very well. You must bring them on board so that you're not lost. So it's a reflex. But much later on, it becomes controlled voluntarily. Much later on in life. So if you have a 1 year old, not 1 year old, maybe say 6-month-old baby, passing of urine is completely a reflex. Once the reflex has been set off, the baby doesn't have to think seriously whether it's in the toilet or not. A 2-month-old baby doesn't have to think hard whether it's being carried by a mother who has her best suit, Sunday suit. No, it will pass urine there. It doesn't have to think. If you have your 2-month-old baby and you have your Sunday best suit and you're carrying and the baby is not in diapers and the reflex sets off, there's no way the baby is going to consider your suit or your, if you put it in the sofa, it will pass you in that sofa. It will not give it up. The baby, therefore, doesn't subject passage of urine to any cortical considerations. There's no thinking, reasoning, planning. But for adults and big children, children who have grown and been taught pottying, have been taught how to pass urine, they will always subject passage of urine to that higher centers. Is it appropriate or not? Remember, we said earlier that, there's always sensory input, there's motor activity, but for a human being, when you receive a sensory input and perform a motor activity, that motor activity must be appropriate. It cannot fail to be appropriate. What makes it appropriate is the higher center, the animal that is between sensory cortex and motor cortex. That animal that is in between there is called the higher center. And the higher center deals with the capacity to think, to reason, to plan, to commit things to memory, affect, to behave, appropriately when you're given bad news. That learned activity is resident within the higher centers. So for an adult and a big child, it's not just a reflex that determines what you do. You have to subject that reflex to a higher control. The reflex will tell you pass urine right there, but of course the higher centers will tell you, look, you are not yet in the toilet. So it will provide you with a mechanism, a voluntary mechanism to constrict your sphincters of passing urine until you end up in the toilet. And then when you reach the toilet, you open the sphincters that you are constricted and you pass urine. So there's some controlling. So we are saying that voiding of urine is a reflex. Unlike the reflexes that you had or talked about in first year, this reflex is under the control of voluntary center for a certain age going upwards. So that's simple. To be able to understand the micturition reflex and what happens once you have manufactured urine, and to ensure that it's fluid, you don't have urine